The lagoon looked calm from a distance. That was the first lie. On the morning of November 20th, 1943, thousands of young American Marines stared across the bright blue water toward a tiny island called Betio, part of the Tarawa Atoll in the Gilbert Islands. Palm trees moved gently in the wind. Sunlight flashed across the Pacific, and somewhere behind the concrete bunkers and tangled barbed wire, nearly 5,000 Japanese defenders waited in silence. Many of the Marines believed the island would fall within a few hours. Some officers had said the bombardment from American battleships would destroy almost everything before the landing even began. But as the first waves moved toward the beach, the Pacific Ocean itself turned against them. The Higgins boats stopped moving hundreds of yards from shore. The coral reef beneath the water was too shallow. The tide had failed to rise high enough. Engines roared uselessly as coxswains cursed and tried to force the boats forward. Then the shooting started. Japanese machine guns opened fire from hidden bunkers that had survived the naval bombardment almost untouched. Mortar rounds exploded across the lagoon. Bullets slammed into steel ramps and tore through crowded landing craft. Marines began climbing over the sides into chest-deep water, holding rifles and radios above their heads while trying to walk through open killing zones. Some drowned under the weight of their gear before ever reaching the beach. Others disappeared into red water after machine gun bursts ripped across the reef. You can almost feel the panic spreading through the lagoon. There was nowhere to hide, no cover, only shallow water, burning sunlight, and thousands of bullets crossing the open reef. Within minutes, entire units lost officers and radio operators. Wounded men floated beside wrecked landing craft, while corpsmen crawled through surf trying to save anyone still breathing. One Marine later described the lagoon as a giant shooting gallery. Another said it felt like the whole ocean was exploding around them. The noise never stopped. Machine guns hammered continuously from reinforced bunkers built from coconut logs, steel, and concrete. Japanese defenders had spent months preparing Beteo for exactly this moment. Admiral Keiji Shibasaki, the island's commander, had reportedly boasted that 1 million Americans could not take Tarawa in 100 years. On that first morning, his confidence no longer sounded insane. Far away at Pearl Harbor, Admiral Chester W. Nimitz waited for reports from the invasion. He already understood that Tarawa mattered far beyond one small island. The Gilbert Islands operation was supposed to prove America could launch major amphibious assaults across the Central Pacific. If Tarawa failed, the entire island hopping strategy toward Japan could collapse before it truly began. But even Nimitz did not yet understand how bad the situation was becoming on the beaches. On Red Beach 1, Marines struggled through water under direct fire for nearly 800 yards. Men dropped one after another while trying to drag machine guns, flamethrowers, and ammunition toward the shore. Some units lost more than half their strength before reaching dry sand. Radios failed after soaking in seawater. Officers became separated from their companies. Tanks sank into shell craters or were knocked out almost immediately. The carefully planned assault was breaking apart in front of everyone. Yet somehow the Marines kept moving. One survivor later remembered seeing wounded men using dead bodies as cover while crawling toward seawalls. Others blasted openings through Japanese defenses with satchel charges while rifle fire tore across the beaches. Small groups became isolated and began fighting their own separate wars across the island. Leadership often passed to the next surviving man without ceremony. Nobody had time for confusion. Survival depended entirely on momentum. Throughout November 20, reports reaching Pearl Harbor became darker by the hour. Casualty numbers climbed rapidly. Communication problems made the situation even worse, because commanders struggled to understand which beaches had actually been secured. Some messages sounded optimistic. Others suggested disaster. Nimitz and his staff studied maps while trying to build a clear picture from scattered fragments of information coming across the Pacific. Then came the photographs. Images from Tarawa showed dead Marines floating in the surf beside shattered landing craft. Burned bodies lay across narrow beaches packed with wreckage. One photograph captured Marines pinned behind a seawall, while bullets struck sand around them. Another showed wounded men stacked beside corpsmen working under fire. These were not images of a clean American victory. These were images of near catastrophe. The battle continued through November 21 and November 22. Marines fought bunker by bunker through smoke, heat, and exhaustion. Japanese defenders refused surrender almost entirely. Flamethrowers blasted through trench systems. Naval guns fired dangerously close to friendly positions. By the final day, the island itself looked destroyed. Palm trees were reduced to black stumps. The air smelled of smoke, explosives, seawater, and death. When organized resistance finally ended on November 23rd, nearly the entire Japanese garrison had been wiped out. Out of roughly 4,800 defenders, only a tiny number survived. But the cost shocked the United States. More than 1,000 Americans had been killed in just 76 hours. Thousands more were wounded. For such a tiny island, the losses felt horrifying. Back home, newspapers published photographs from the beaches. Many Americans had never seen war presented so directly before. The images disturbed the public deeply. Questions spread quickly. How could such a small island cost so many lives? Why had the Marines been forced to cross open reefs under machine gun fire? Why had the bombardment failed to destroy the defenses? Those questions haunted Nimitz too. Most people remember Tarawa as one of the bloodiest battles of the Pacific War. What many forget is what happened immediately afterward. Because once the firing stopped, Nimitz began studying Tarawa almost like a man investigating a shipwreck. He did not simply celebrate victory and move on. He wanted every mistake exposed before the next invasion began. That decision changed the Pacific War. Within days, Nimitz ordered detailed analysis of nearly every aspect of the battle. Officers interviewed survivors from landing craft crews, Marine units, naval gunfire teams, medical corpsmen, and intelligence staff. Reports poured into Pearl Harbor describing failures in communication, reconnaissance, tides, naval bombardment, logistics, and coordination. Nothing was too small to examine. Nimitz understood something terrifying. Tarawa had been won partly through courage, but courage alone could not carry American forces across the entire Pacific. The reef problem became one of the first major issues under review. Pre-invasion intelligence had badly underestimated how shallow the lagoon would become during low tide. Higgins boats carrying Marines had been left stranded far from shore, turning the landing into a massacre. But some tracked amphibious vehicles called LVTs had managed to cross the reef successfully. Nimitz immediately recognized their importance. Production of amphibious tractors increased dramatically after Tarawa. More units received training with them. Future invasions would depend heavily on tracked landing vehicles capable of crossing reefs and rough terrain. It sounds simple now, but at Tarawa the lesson had been written in blood across hundreds of yards of coral and surf. Then there was the bombardment problem. American battleships and cruisers had fired massive amounts of shells before the invasion. Many commanders initially believed the island had been nearly destroyed. But Japanese bunkers survived because the bombardment was too short and not accurate enough against deeply reinforced positions. Marines arriving on the beaches discovered machine gun nests still fully operational. Nimitz pushed for major changes in pre-invasion naval bombardment tactics. Future assaults received longer bombardments with more systematic targeting. Pilots, naval gunfire officers, and reconnaissance teams worked more closely together. Airstrikes became more coordinated with amphibious operations. At islands like Kwajalein and Saipan, American firepower would become far more devastating, partly because of what had gone wrong at Tarawa. Another major lesson came from underwater reconnaissance. Before Tarawa, intelligence gathering around beaches remained limited and often incomplete. But after the battle, Nimitz supported expanded use of underwater demolition teams to study reefs, obstacles, tides, and beach defenses before future invasions. These early teams later evolved into the famous Navy underwater demolition teams, the ancestors of modern Navy SEALs. The changes did not stop there. Medical evacuation procedures also came under intense review. At Tarawa, wounded Marines often remained trapped on beaches for hours because landing craft could not move properly through the reef and chaos. Corpsmen worked under unimaginable conditions, while shortages of supplies and transport slowed treatment. Nimitz ordered improvements in casualty evacuation systems, medical coordination, and beach organization for future amphibious assaults. Even communication failures became lessons. At Tarawa, soaked radios failed constantly. Units became isolated because equipment could not survive the landing conditions. Nimitz pushed for improvements in waterproofing communication gear and better coordination between Navy and Marine units. More backup systems were introduced. Greater flexibility was encouraged at lower command levels because Tarawa proved how quickly battle plans could collapse once troops hit the beach. But perhaps the most important thing Nimitz changed was psychological. Before Tarawa, many American commanders still underestimated Japanese defensive doctrine. Some believed naval bombardment and superior firepower alone could break island defenses quickly. Tarawa shattered that illusion. Japanese forces fought from deeply prepared fortifications with extreme discipline and determination. Every bunker had to be destroyed individually. Every trench became a separate battlefield. Nimitz understood that future operations would require overwhelming preparation, not optimism. That realization shaped the next stages of the Pacific Campaign. In January 1944, just weeks after Tarawa, American forces attacked Kwajalein Atoll in the Marshall Islands. This time the operation looked very different. Bombardments lasted longer, reconnaissance improved, amphibious coordination became tighter. More amphibious tractors crossed reefs successfully. Casualties were dramatically lower compared to Tarawa. The difference was impossible to ignore. Many Marines later believed the men who died at Tarawa had unknowingly saved countless lives afterward, because their battle exposed weaknesses before even larger invasions began. Nimitz himself seemed to understand this deeply. He reportedly viewed Tarawa not as proof of American strength, but as a warning about the true cost of Pacific amphibious warfare. And the Pacific War was only growing larger. Across 1944, American forces moved steadily closer toward Japan. Saipan, Guam, Tinian, Peleliu, Leyte, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. Each invasion involved enormous complexity. Naval gunfire, air support, logistics, intelligence gathering, amphibious tractors, underwater reconnaissance, medical evacuation, and beach coordination all became more advanced, partly because Tarawa forced painful lessons early in the campaign. You can trace a direct line from the reef at Betio to nearly every major amphibious operation that followed. Yet most people rarely hear about the weeks after Tarawa. The battle itself overshadows everything else. The famous photographs, the brutal casualty numbers, the stories of Marines crossing the lagoon under fire. But behind the scenes, Nimitz was conducting something equally important. He was transforming failure into adaptation before the next operations began. That ability mattered enormously in the Pacific War. Japan often expected American forces to repeat mistakes. Instead, American commanders increasingly studied failures with ruthless honesty. Tarawa became one of the clearest examples of this approach. Nimitz did not protect reputations. He did not hide weaknesses behind propaganda. He wanted answers. Fast. Some officers found the investigations uncomfortable. Reports openly criticized planning assumptions and operational mistakes. But Nimitz believed learning quickly mattered more than protecting pride. In wartime, delay meant more dead Marines on future beaches. The emotional weight of Tarawa also stayed with survivors for years. Veterans remembered the smell of burned bunkers. They remembered wounded men crying in the surf at night. Some remembered sharks appearing in the lagoon after the battle. Others never forgot the sight of Marines lying motionless across reefs that should never have been crossed on foot. For many young Marines, Tarawa destroyed any remaining illusion about the Pacific War being quick or simple, and still the campaign continued. Nimitz rarely displayed dramatic emotion publicly. His leadership style remained calm, measured, and analytical. But those around him understood Tarawa affected him deeply. He had sent those Marines into battle believing the operation was necessary for the broader Pacific strategy. Now, over 1,000 Americans were dead on a tiny island most people had never heard of before November 1943. The pressure on him became enormous. Future invasions could not turn into repeated Tarawas. That urgency drove many of the rapid changes implemented during early 1944. Amphibious warfare became more scientific, more coordinated, and far more overwhelming in terms of firepower. Intelligence gathering expanded. Beach studies improved. Naval bombardments became heavier and more precise. Specialized units gained greater importance. Logistics planning grew increasingly detailed. By mid-1944, American amphibious operations looked noticeably different from Tarawa. At Saipan, in June 1944, enormous naval bombardments struck Japanese defenses before landings began. Underwater demolition teams helped clear obstacles. Amphibious coordination improved significantly. The battle itself remained incredibly brutal, but the overall operational system had evolved. Tarawa had become the classroom. There is another reason historians still study what Nimitz did after Tarawa. He understood that public perception mattered too. The shocking photographs released from the battle sparked debate across the United States. Some officials worried the images would damage morale, but others believed Americans needed to understand the real cost of defeating Japan. Unlike many governments during wartime, the United States allowed significant publication of Tarawa images and film footage. Americans saw dead Marines in ways that earlier wars had often hidden from public view. The honesty shocked the country, yet it also reinforced the seriousness of the Pacific Campaign. Nimitz supported realism over fantasy. He knew the war ahead would become even harder. And he was right. Iwo Jima and Okinawa later produced casualty levels far beyond Tarawa. But by then, American amphibious warfare had matured enormously compared to late 1943. Lessons learned at Tarawa influenced everything from naval gunfire doctrine to landing craft organization. Sometimes history remembers battles but forgets adaptation. It remembers explosions but not planning rooms. It remembers victory speeches, but not exhausted officers studying maps at midnight, searching for answers. Tarawa was not only a battlefield, it became a warning signal for the entire Pacific command structure. Nimitz listened to that warning. One of the clearest examples came from tidal intelligence. After Tarawa, hydrographic studies became much more detailed before invasions. Tide patterns, reefs, currents, and underwater terrain received greater attention because commanders now understood how environmental mistakes could destroy entire landing plans. Something as simple as water depth could decide whether hundreds lived or died. That lesson came directly from Marines trapped in the lagoon. Another overlooked change involved combined arms coordination. Tarawa exposed how difficult it was to synchronize naval guns, aircraft, tanks, engineers, and infantry during amphibious assaults. Nimitz encouraged tighter integration between branches. Future operations increasingly relied on joint planning rather than separate systems working independently. This cooperation became one of America's greatest strengths by the later years of the war. Even simple equipment changed because of Tarawa. Better flamethrowers, improved waterproofing, stronger amphibious vehicles, enhanced radio systems, more effective bunker destruction tactics. Every improvement carried echoes of Betio's beaches. For the Marines who survived, those improvements often felt personal. Some veterans later visited Tarawa decades after the war. They found quiet beaches where one of the Pacific War's most violent battles had unfolded in only 3 days. Palm trees had returned. Waves rolled gently across reefs where young men once fought desperately under machine gun fire. Time softened the island's appearance, but not its history, because beneath the calm water remained one of the most important turning points in Pacific amphibious warfare. And at the center of that turning point stood Chester Nimitz, not charging across beaches, not delivering dramatic speeches, but studying failure carefully enough to change an entire campaign. That may be the part people talk about least. Hollywood often prefers battlefield heroics, but wars are also shaped by what commanders do after battles end. The decisions made in quiet headquarters can determine whether future invasions become disasters or successes. After Tarawa, Nimitz refused to pretend everything had gone according to plan. That honesty became one of his greatest strengths as a commander. By 1945, American forces stood at the edge of Japan itself. The island-hopping campaign had crossed thousands of miles of ocean through some of the most heavily defended territory on Earth. The system supporting those invasions had become massive, organized, and deadly efficient compared to the confused chaos of Tarawa's first morning. But the foundation of many improvements began there, among the reefs and wreckage of Betio. You can almost imagine Nimitz studying casualty reports late at night after the battle, understanding that every statistic represented a young Marine who had trusted the plan. That responsibility stayed with him, and instead of burying mistakes, he forced the Pacific Fleet to confront them directly. That is why Tarawa mattered beyond its size. It was not just another island captured on the map. It became the moment when the United States fully realized what it would take to defeat Japan across the Pacific. Not simply bravery, not simply firepower, but adaptation at incredible speed. The Marines who crossed those reefs in November 1943 paid for that realization with their lives. And what Nimitz did afterward ensured the lesson would not be wasted.